can be held responsible for a very large amount of the unfortunate pressure that bothers us today. Materialism sustains crime, helps to build a constant fear, makes the individual highly materialistic because he knows no other outlet, helps to build a constant fear, makes the individual highly materialistic because he knows no other outlet, and little by little the world comes to be afraid of life, afraid of the existence of which, in which it passes its days here in the world. Asclepius and Hermes in the dialogue pointed out that the time would come when Egypt, which of course was a symbol of the whole world, would forget its gods, that it would deteriorate, that it would depart from heaven, that it would build false images, false goals, and false purposes to justify its own errors, that it would go into a state of conflict with all other things, that it would waste the values of the earth. He points out definitely that the earth would be impoverished, the soil would be impoverished, that the humanity living would have no conception of its responsibilities, but would live for pleasure and profit alone. And as this happened, gradually the planet would become a desert. That everything that was useful would no longer be able to function or manifest itself. But that in spite of this, that something inside of the human being could not die. This eternal life that was recognized in the great mystery system went on. And also in the course of time, the life within the individual would revolt against the misconduct of his mind, emotions, and body. And when the great tragedy revealed itself to be the result of human selfishness, cupidity, and ignorance, the humanity would then go back to the gods, go back to the divine principle within himself, and create a new world emerging out of his own repentance, out of his own realization of his mistake, out of his own fear, perhaps, of the final destruction of himself and everything that exists. But nothing will be destroyed. It is all part of the illusion. It is an illusion which continues until the human being makes peace with universal law. When the human being accepts the governorship of the great values of life, he is then no longer subject to the infirmities of the flesh. If you look at the various sacred buildings of the world, you will notice that nearly all of them are symbols of aspiration and ascent. And for this, we have to go back to the very primitive form of astronomy. The ancient astronomy divided existence into three levels, the lowest being the planes of elements, the second level being the planes of planets, and the third and higher level, the plane of the zodiac or the fixed stars, which incidentally could be a tomb, because it would then become a witness to the fact that the being in the tomb was not really dead. The tomb became then a symbol of belief in the resurrection. It was a monument to prove that it was over the body only, and that the soul, mind, and spirit had ascended into a better world. This ascent was represented in India by the use of a cube and a pyramid. The pyramid was placed on the cube to represent the union of the material quaternary and the spiritual triad. It was an ascending problem. All through the present Buddhist world, graves are in the form of little stupas or pagodas with 5 levels to represent the ascent of life, and the headstone became a ladder to lead to the higher worlds and to bear witness to the fact that the person buried there knew his own immortality and would go on to freedom and liberation. The enlightened person was always represented by a grave marker which was the symbol of immortality and not the symbol of death. In Cambodia and in many buildings, this particular concept was created by means of a cube and a sphere. And spheres were also placed in the Great Pyramid and have been found there. Small articles to represent levels or planes, to level truly the levels of stones. A small sphere was placed upon them. If it did not roll off, the stones were true. This sphere became a dome rising from a quaternary. And this dome itself became the symbol, as far as we are concerned, of the invisible causal nature which surmounts and overwhelms and dominates the material body. Therefore, a building with a dome is a symbol of the recognition of the power of the divine over the natural life of the individual. The body below was a cube, square, or a building of cubical structure. The dome was the symbol of the overshadowing of divinity. The overshadowing, the recognition that heaven moves like a great dome forever over the surface of the earth. The earth was the cube, the dome was the heaven moving above it. And the dome gradually became the minaret, it became the steeple of the church, it became the dome of the Capitol building in Washington, the dome of the Vatican, and mysterious domes on the Muslim mosques, and the mysterious pyramid forms that we find in some Protestant churches, as in the case of the Westminster Abbey, which has the pyramid over the central entrance. All of these together represent the survival of a language that had to do with the human realization of his own nature. The pyramid stood upon the earth. It represented a flame ascending. It was a radiant structure that had been built in ancient times, but it was always pointing upward. It was always impelling the individual to follow an ascending line and look up to the stars. At various seasons of the year, by looking up, the beholder gazed upon the constellations, the figures, and the mysterious language written upon the wall of heaven. Gaffarel, who was the secretary of Cardinal Richelieu, wrote a book in which he showed that the star groups were in the form of consonant letters of the Chaldaic alphabet that later became the ancient Hebrew. These constellational patterns were consonants. The planets moving through them were vowels. And by studying this proposition, the handwriting on the wall of heaven could be read. It's an interesting theory and has been given some attention, but not too much in recent times. But we have the great dome of heaven moving upon the earth. We also have the pyramid as the house of a mysterious elevation, the four square of the base, from which rises the pyramidal form, consisting of four triangles, each with three sides, which make 12 lines or 12 angles, which represent the zodiac. The building was oriented to the 11th decimal point and was probably perfect at one time, but there is damage to one wall of it as a result of an earthquake. I never was quite strong enough and physical enough to climb the outside of the pyramid. Very few people are. It is really an arduous job. You have to have about 4 daggermen or natives to help you. 2 would go in front, scrambled up one of the blocks, which is about 4 feet, and pull. The other 2 are behind and push, and you are gradually elevated level by level over the hundreds of levels that lead to the top. This is a little too much for the average person, especially in the desert where the temperature is apt to be well over 100. But I did go through all of the interior rooms, the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber, and as far as we could get in the grand passageways leading downward. One thing was very evident, and has been discovered, and that is that the inside of the pyramid, the temperature, is the mean temperature of the earth. For the average person, it is colder than Christmas. It is a constant chill, and it is a dead chill. There is no modifying circumstance. And many persons who come out of the pyramid into the heat of the sun have very serious colds and occasionally pneumonia. But this peculiar deadness inside was probably put there or achieved for a purpose. It was probably in this deadness that the transcendent or suspension of life in the ceremony of the coming forth by day was performed. The individual was in the tomb. He was attended by the priests. He was dead. And like the prodigal son, whose father said, "My son was dead, but he is alive again." Humanity was the prodigal son. There were two ways of growing in this world. One was to grow slowly by cause and effect and by the labors of living. The world itself became a great temple in which initiation took place over a period of hundreds of lives. But to the ancients there was a wise man's way. And this wise man's way was to pass through by conscious intent and by purification the mystery of the whole cycle in one embodiment. Now one might say this would be the simple way. And I know a lot of metaphysicians at the present time who can hardly wait for that one embodiment that's going to do it all. But most of them have forgotten something. Namely, that this one embodiment means that everything accomplished in hundreds of lives must be accomplished in that one embodiment. It's not just a shortcut. It is a gathering up and intensifying the process of human regeneration. It means that the person must attain to a state by discipline, by dedication, and in accordance with universal law that qualifies him to receive this very important ritual. And after he has received the ritual, after he has had the experience, he is not released from responsibility, but brought into the presence of a greater responsibility. Having become, as Apuleius points out, a citizen of two worlds, the individual must act accordingly. He also learns from certain experiences along the way what he can't do and what he can do. He learns, for example, that if he is interested in primarily in his own security, he has already failed. It is not a case of where he is doing this to become nobler, more enlightened, more successful than other people. He is doing it for one purpose only, that he can be a better servant of the infinite. The ritual produces dedicated disciples of wisdom, not satisfied people who sit back and try to nurse their own intelligence. It is a case in which every step carries with it a heavy burden of duty, and that the final achievement requires the complete abnegation of personal self-interest, a complete overcoming of the problems of egoism and egotism. Otherwise, all is lost. Furthermore, there can be no backsliding, because the individual must reach a state of certainty before this enlightenment is given that makes it utterly and completely impossible to backslide. He cannot get it and then fail and turn from it. If he turns from it, it means he never had it. If he fails, he fails himself. He cannot fail the infinite. So that the rituals of the initiations of those times were very, very severe. There is an account that Thomas Taylor is said to have found in the records of the British Museum, although no proof is available of it. It is interesting, at least. Namely, that Plato was initiated in the Great Pyramid. And it was there that he received his own final enlightenment. But this presents another problem. If he was initiated in the Great Pyramid in the 4th century B.C., how did he get in? All those capstones were in place. Everything was closed. The answer would appear to be that there must be other entrances. there must be some other way of getting into the building. When Mamun, the Caliph of Baghdad, was fuddling with the pyramid, trying to get into it, it occurred to him that his native followers would probably be pretty unhappy and might very well turn against him when they found there were no treasures in there to reward them for their effort, because when they got in there, the building was empty. There was no mummy, there was no body of a previous pharaoh, although the walls had not been disturbed. And that makes it seem very unlikely that it was a tomb, primarily. But one of his natives, one of Mamun's natives, while fussing around in the excavation, suddenly disappeared, and later appeared out in the desert half mad. This seems to suggest that there was some way in or out of the building. The wall or cliff upon which the pyramid was built has been carefully studied. There is no openings that have been found. The Sphinx has been pierced with rods throughout its entire body, but no openings have been found within it. And it, of course, the Sphinx was a living outcropping of rock. It was not built. The only thing that was built were the front paws. In other words, if it was true, did the initiation ceremony take place when the person was voluntarily out of the physical body? The ancient priests were able to function out of the body. This there can be no reasonable doubt. And it is also mentioned in a number of early Christian reports. Namely, that it was that it was possible for the invisible bodies of the individual to be separated from the visible without a loss of consciousness or a loss of intelligence, and that the invisible body could travel to distant places and could have various experiences. And many people believe this is a comparatively common happening in sleep, that the individual is not actually asleep spiritually, only physically, and that the superphysical vehicles are just as busy while he's asleep as when he is awake. But regardless of this particular point, it is possible that the initiations of the pyramid were given while the candidate was out of the physical body. If so, then there would be no problem of the difficulty of getting into the building. The superphysical vehicles could go through very easily. Another problem that arises in connection with the pyramid project is something that is coming along now, namely that the pyramid was some kind of a vibratory structure, radiating energy and having some strange virtue in itself, and that meditation upon the pyramidal shape produces certain changes in the human consciousness. The particular shape, angle, and tip of the pyramid, its proportions and so forth, having very definite significance. Now, this point is not original now. It is referred to in very ancient times, for it was believed and taught that in Egypt, as earlier than Pythagoras of Samos, that is the 6th century BC, the Egyptians represented their deities by symmetrical geometric solids, and that in the temples, the 5 perfect solids were used to represent the principal deities, that each of them with a different shape, a different proportion, and a different arrangement represented one of the deities, and that, most important of all, the contemplation of these forms had meaning, that the contemplation of the symmetric solids could heal disease, could expand consciousness, could relieve the mind of distress, and could calm the emotions. Each of these forms, then, was, in a sense, therapeutic, because perfect harmony is always therapeutic. If music as harmony can improve health, then we may say that the harmonic solids are a form of music captured in material like metal, stone, or crystals, and have the same effect as music, color, or any other therapeutic factor. Form and shape exercise a spiritual authority over the individual. Now, this was known to the Chinese, or at least believed by them, and we find traces of this in the I Ching. Most of all, however, we find in the Orient that painting and scenery, beautiful symbolic designs, mandalas, were particularly important in releasing the individual from the negative moods of life, that he was able to contemplate more fully and by relaxing could take harmony into himself. One of the problems we face today is the constant pressure of inharmony. We live in a world in which very little is the way we wish it was. We are all constantly under the pressure of worry, anxiety, fear, despondency, irritation, aggravation. These things press in upon us all the time. We are also afflicted by the very appearance of our civilization. There is nothing more depressing than the average city. And there are very few things much more depressing than the average house, because people simply have not the insight or the understanding to build structures suitable to the release of their own consciousness. The individual concerned only with physical comfort may live in an environment which makes his spiritual nature completely uncomfortable. Also, public buildings now no longer have their foundation in the Dionysian artificers of old, who built buildings according to the laws of the gods and the geometry of nature. Today we build them largely to look like blocks of ice because that is the cheapest way to put them together. They cost millions as it is, but they have nothing. There is no warmth, there is no real beauty, but finally the average individual tries to put his own concept of beauty into them and looks at one of these atrocities and says it's wonderful. Simply because he has become accustomed to something that was not right, until he finally accepts deformity as normalcy. This type of thing the ancients didn't believe in. And probably the most perfect structure that antiquity knew was the pyramid. The pyramid had several advantages. First of all, it was simple. It had no details. It had no structural peculiarities that would distort or clutter up the fine mathematical proportion. It was a perfect example of geometry. It was in all its parts balanced, orderly, methodical. It was exactly what it appeared to be, and it was in all ways suitable for the sacred purpose for which it was intended. So this type of building had the simplicity of an almost archetypal reality. What most people do not realize is that ultimately the universe is very simple. It is man who complicates it. The universe is a simple process unfolding in its own way and has always been a direct unfoldment of principles. Man, however, has confused the issue completely. He has distorted and rearranged things for his own pleasures with no consideration for their essential natures or the principles for which they were intended. Recently, in Java, on Indonesia, a restoration process has been used on the Great Pyramid at Jakarta, known now as the Borobudur. This great Buddhist monument is another one of those mysteries. It is a pyramid. It is a perfect pyramid in a sense, but it represents a different philosophy of life. Therefore, it is presented with somewhat modified symbolism. Up to about 25, 30 years ago, this great monument, which is probably one of the largest religious structures on earth, was gradually fading away. The rock from which it was composed was weathering out of existence. The lack of adequate foundation was undermining its stability, and suddenly the world decided something should be done about it. So the UNESCO started a program for the restoration of the Borobudur. And the job has been very, very well done at expense of many millions of dollars. But this great religious monument now stands as it was originally intended to stand. It is a pyramid that rises up through 7 levels, much like the ziggurat of Babylon and Chaldea. The upper or apex part of the pyramid, of the Borobudur, was a pagoda-like stupa, or a reliquary, with 2 rooms in it, which was empty. The restoration of it has never been able to find anything for that empty room. The building builds up to a symbol and then ceases. And this is the same thing that happens in the pyramid. The capstone of the pyramid is missing. The sacred relic that was supposed to be in the capstone or head of the Borobudur is also missing. So that all these things represent a certain unfinishedness. And it reminds us, perhaps, that in natural law and in the reactions within our own natures, everything that belongs to the material world is unfinished. Existence, mortal existence, is an unfinished business. And it takes place in an unfinished world and challenges everything that lives here with the restrictions of an unfinished realization of truth. Everything is growing, but nothing has completed its growth. Everything is getting better, but nothing in the mortal world has finally achieved the state of being best. Everything we try to do, everything we try to work with, science particularly, should have a complete understanding of the mystery of the missing capstone, because science is worrying over it right at the moment, but on a different level of thought. Everything that science discovers leads somewhere, but when it just about gets to the point where it looks as though it might tell us a great truth, it fades away. All visible things, if you trace them upward to their highest conditions, disappear. All of the intellectual achievements of the individual or of the great system of learning, this ascends from one level of genius to another, but the supreme genius has never been reached. The supreme answer to the problem of life has never been reached. All that we have for these particular conclusions is our own inward realization. So the formula is rather simple. We can build everything on the outside up to a point, but to complete it we must call entirely upon the inside. It is our own inner life that must perfect every structure that is formed in the material world. The answer to everything lies in ourselves. We can read books up to a certain point. We can use laboratory experiments up to a certain point. But somewhere along the line, as the alchemists learned, and they studied from the Alexandrian savants, these alchemists learned that the final ingredient of the transmutation was man himself, the internal part of his own nature. His own soul had to transform base metals into gold. Each individual soul must perfect the structure of his life. Otherwise, it will never be perfected. So to account for this, nearly every monument of importance in the world either has the top part missing or a bad scar in it, something imperfect, something that represents a flaw in the original purpose, because the completion of it must always depend upon the consciousness of the person beholding it. Otherwise, the secret cannot be perfected. Another interesting aspect of the pyramid problem has to do with the pattern of the Egyptian temple system. I think there's a good probability that somewhere there was some form of contact between the pyramid and one of the other temples of Egypt. This may have been, however, intentionally closed off at some time. This presents us with a very curious circumstance. The king's chamber in the pyramid, hidden within 200 feet of masonry in all directions, was originally ventilated. 2 air shafts went from the king's chamber in an upright diagonal motion to the surface of the pyramid. But when the capping stones and the casing stones were put in place, those air chambers, those air passageways were sealed off. In other words, they come to the surface but are now covered, or were covered originally, by the casing stones. There was no aperture. They were not ventilated, but they were originally intended for ventilation. The answer seems to be, therefore, that something in there had to be alive and had to have air, although there is no clue to what it might have been. Of course, the present openings have nothing to do with the ancient design of the pyramid. Why, for instance, would it be called the tomb of Hermes? What and who was Hermes? Hermes was the Greek form of the deity Mercury, and the Egyptian form of Mercury and Hermes was Thoth, the god of the writing tablet. Hermes was a symbol of the universal mind, because it was said of him in his own day, whenever that was, because he is probably also a symbol invented by the Alexandrian esotericists. He is not known prior to the rise of Alexandria. What was that he was the author of 10,000 books, and some of the old stories tell us that he was the author of every book that was ever written in the world. Well, the implication is pretty obvious, namely that he has to represent the power of mind, which is the author of all things. Therefore, Hermes is universal mind. He is the universal mind that may have been symbolically buried in the Great Pyramid, which is supposed to have been his tomb. Not a Pharaoh, but the universal mind itself, which in turn might point out the idea of a universal symbolism, that the secret of the mind was built into the structure of the pyramid, and therefore the investigation of the pyramid could ultimately lead to the discovery of the nature of mind. In any event, however, Hermes, as the author of all the books in the world, became, in a sense at least, the symbol of the great esoteric schools. He became the scribe of the gods, the interpreter of heaven. He attended the psychostasia, or the weighing of the soul of the dead, in the great Egyptian mortuary papyri and paintings. And Budge and also Breasted of Chicago were perfectly aware that the Book of the Dead was a symbolic document, and that the symbolism of the death and resurrection of the soul in that book was based upon the rituals of the mysteries. Here we have a parallel, therefore, that we have to consider, namely that in the old papyri, the tomb of the deceased person was nearly always portrayed as a pyramid. It was a pyramid upon a square base, and the opening of the base was in the bottom, not on the pyramid top, it's in the square base. Therefore, the implication could be that there was an opening in the pyramid below the level of its foundation. But in any event, this ritual was the story of the soul's journey into the afterlife, and was a very complicated story in the Egyptian mythology. But it all was condensed into a fraction of its original length in a ritual performed by the Egyptian priests. Breasted told me that he was perfectly aware that it was a ritual when he translated these papyri. And this ritual was the ritual of coming forth by day. Those who die the ordinary death go forth by night, according to the Egyptians, and they wander in a kind of darkness, of uncertainty. They wander through a universe that is benign, wonderful, loving, but like an infant, they have no memory or no conscious thought of where they're going. So those of that type who just simply die as they have lived, asleep as to reality, who have never improved themselves by any conscious effort, these are the little ones. They're not evil, they're not doomed for perdition. Their mistakes will not prevent them from growing. But they are still unable to come forth by day which means they cannot come forth consciously. They cannot come forth lighted by their own inner light. So they are the ones who must wait, or must go to the Amentet. The Amentet, or Elysian fields, being the paradise of Egypt. The soul of the Egyptian who died went on into the other world and did what he did here. There is the story, of course, of the moneylender who died in Egypt in the old days. He was a good man. He was honest in his money lending. He never cheated anybody. He was very sincere, but he had no knowledge of anything but money lending. So when he died, they gave him a table and some small change and told him to keep right on going. So he kept on borrowing and money. As a ghost, he lent money to spirits who did not exist except in himself, and received interest on them and lived very happily, enjoying the life he was familiar with. And this he would continue to do until he was brought back into embodiment. And then gradually, little by little, he would outgrow it. But there was no force in it. There was no evil in it. There was nothing terrible that was going to happen to him. He was going to be very happy because he was a good man. Virtue rewards with happiness in the afterlife. It may not result in illumination, because the average person who passes on will not be happy with illumination. He will be happy only with the things that are familiar to him. The way of life he has always known is what will make him happy. But after the initiation rites have been performed, the individual comes forth by day. He realizes his place in the plan. He realizes what is next for him. He realizes that going into this larger life is an opportunity to correct all failings of his own thinking. They will come closer and closer to the eternal truths, which are the source of his ultimate union with deity. So by coming forth by day, he comes consciously into the afterlife, fully equipped to face its mysteries, fully equipped to adjust to its circumstances, and already able, at least dimly, to perceive the face of the great God that hides behind the veil. And in Egypt, I think the Egyptians believed that the Great Pyramid was the symbol of the state of consciousness, the state of the internal life of the individual, which in perfect mathematical order and harmony comes forth out of the body in the light and is led by the master of the secret house into the presence of the great gods, where he receives the Kroiksan Sata, the symbol of everlasting life. Everlasting life is not the fact that we live forever, for we do that whether we know it or not. But everlasting life is to know it, to realize it, to understand it, not to doubt or to fear. We have a life, as the Egyptians said, unto everlastingness. But only those who have retained a certain inward light know for certain that which others hope. And as one of the Roman philosophers said, wisdom brings knowledge to those who have hoped, and brings perfect understanding to those who have lived in a certain optimism, but not certain of that which is to come. But the mysteries may put the whole universe in order. They put the individual in order. They made everything as it was and as it should be. And the pyramid, according to the Egyptians, was a testimony set up under the directions of deities and their architects and artisans, so that all men might know that forever and ever the great light, the great good, and the flame of aspiration would burn in man. And if as long as it burns in man, it will burn in the world. But if it goes out in man, it goes out forever. So the wisdom of the ancients was to continually introduce and initiate the worthy into the real purpose of the plan, to help them to understand the great dignity of life, the great value and virtue of obedience to law, and that forever the pact between heaven and earth was sealed by the symbolism of the pyramid. This is what the Alexandrians worked out and thought about it, and I think it comes rather close to the facts of the matter. Well, I guess that's all for today.